part of the Balkan campaign in April 1941, Germany and its allies occupied and partitioned Yugoslavia. In Serbia, Nazi Germany established a military occupation administration, while Croatia became an independent state under the umbrella of German and Italian forces. Other areas of Yugoslavia were annexed by neighboring Axis countries, Hungary, Italy, and Bulgaria. Different occupation zones shaped the manner, circumstances, and chronology of the final solution in Yugoslavia. There were about 16,000 Jews in Serbia living under German occupation. Jewish men were murdered in mass shootings in the proximity of Belgrade or in the fall of 1941. The Jews were disproportionately singled out as victims of German reprisals and draconian measures to quell the Serbian uprising against the occupation forces. The next stage of the final solution took place in the winter of 1941-1942, when women and children were taken to the Sajmište concentration camp established on the outskirts of Belgrade. By May 1942, they were either killed on site or in a moving van, in which victims were suffocated to death with carbon monoxide. The Nazis murdered approximately 14,500 Jews, or 90% of the community. Serbia was officially announced Judenrein in August 1942. To put these events into a wider perspective, the first systematic shooting of Serbian Jews in the fall of 1941 took place a few days before the deportation of Jews from Germany began, while the gassing of Serbian Jews in the spring of 1942 was completed even before the gas chambers in Sobibor and Treblinka started operating.
Hello, everyone. This is Jeffrey Geisner, founder of the Jewish Culture and Holocaust and Stand Against Hate communities. And I'm happy to introduce Julie Brill, who has written a tremendous book called Hidden in Plain Sight. You can see it there behind Julie. That's available on Amazon. It's about the Holocaust in Serbia and Yugoslavia, which is a really interesting topic that I haven't covered yet. So we're going to start our discussion today, Julie, with having you tell us a little bit about yourself, a little bit about your parents, your time of growing up in a Holocaust family, and then you'll take us into your story.
Sure. So I grew up in the 70s and 80s outside of Boston, suburban American childhood. But my father had a very different experience. He was born in 1938 in Belgrade, Yugoslavia. And so that meant that he was not even 3 years old when the Germans invaded. And he would tell me from very early on his early childhood stories. I think it's really normal for parents to tell their children, things that happened to them when they themselves were kids. And for my dad, these were things that happened to him during the war. They were very vivid, snapshots of things that had happened. So his earliest memory was the bombing, the German bombing of Belgrade, and that was April 1941. He remembered the sounds the bombs made. He remembered running through the streets with his mother. They were running towards a bomb shelter. And he remembered coming back, and for some reason, my grandmother had the presence of mind. She took a plate full of cookies and she put it on the wardrobe as they were leaving. And when they came back, my toddler father looked at this plate and was fascinated. It had split in two. And he remembered dropping a cup and the cup had shattered. And why did this special plate with the cookies on it just break into two? And as a little child, I marveled at that. Yeah, Dad, how did that plate, what happened to that plate? And now as an adult thinking about it, it's like, that's the amount of destruction that his young brain could think about. The bombing was a complete surprise. There had been no declaration of war. And reading the accounts, some of the civilians in Belgrade thought it was an air show. They had no frame of reference that they were being attacked. All of the attacks were on civilian targets. There were only civilian targets, particularly Dorchel, which is the Jewish neighborhood where my family was living. So my father couldn't process that. He could just process this plate. And so I thought about his early memories a lot as a kid. It was almost like he was a child telling me, another child, this thing that had happened. It felt very close. It felt very recent. It didn't feel like a generation and an ocean was protecting me from the Holocaust. And so I thought a lot about the Holocaust. And I learned about it, I think, the way a lot of children in families with survivors do. I learned about the very personal stories first, and then gradually the larger story. This is not obviously now just something that happened in my family, right? So I went to Hebrew school in the early 80s as a preteen and learned a certain kind of Holocaust history, which I think is still, in a way, largely what children learn. We learned about Germany and the slow rise of Nazism and the Holocaust. And we learned about Anne Frank as a child, hidden with her family in Amsterdam. And we learned about the cattle cars and the gas chambers of Auschwitz and what happened in Poland. We did not learn what happened in Eastern Europe. So I had no framework for what my father was telling me, how to plug that into a larger story. Weirdly, I both thought the Holocaust could happen to me like it had happened to my family, and the Holocaust hadn't happened to my family because if it had, why was no one talking about it? So that was sort of where I started from collecting these stories.
Well, you mentioned that you have a grandmother. Is that, and she was living with you so you had grandparents who survived the Holocaust?
My grandfather sadly was murdered, and I can tell you that story, but it very early in the Holocaust, November 1941, before the U.S. had even entered the war with Pearl Harbor. My
And
grandmother,
where and how was he murdered?
so these are the stories that my father told me, and I was always trying to understand how they were Holocaust stories. They were and they weren't. But what happened in Serbia was the Germans do this surprise bombing. Within a short period of time, they're boots on the ground. They're occupying the capital city. My father remembers he wasn't supposed to, but he would sneak peeks out the front window. He could see the German soldiers marching by in pairs. His mother told him not to, but he was curious. Little child. And very quickly they are registering the Jewish men for slave labor. And I know that my grandfather was part of that registration because I have his name on a list. Um, Two pictures from childhood of my grandfather. One is his wedding picture, one is him holding my father as a baby. And the third picture, which I wonder if is also a picture of him, it's a picture of the registration of the Jewish men of Belgrade. I've looked at that picture so many times. The faces past the front row are blurry, but I know my grandfather was there that day because his name is on the list, and I found that through my research. So the men are registered to do slave labor. One of the unusual things in Belgrade is they're not in a camp initially. They go home at night. So my grandfather reported 6 days a week for work. He had to, he didn't get paid. Terrible work. What we know from a street pass that I found and translated was he was doing sewer repair. So one of the things the bombing did was it destroyed the sewers in Belgrade. That's part of why so many civilians left. Imagine a capital city without a working sewer system and it's spring. So the Jews one of the things they were forced to do was sewer repair. My grandfather before the war was a clerk, so I picture him kind of in his office clothes, digging ditches and laying pipe. That went on from April of 1941 until around my father's third birthday. August of 1941. And then one night my grandfather didn't come home. That's also an early memory for my father. He remembers my grandmother screaming, and she was pregnant at that point with my aunt. Of course, she thought the worst, that he was dead. There was a curfew. She couldn't go outside. There was no radio. There was no phone. There was no way to, find out what was going on. But what was going on was that the Jewish men were now being held in a camp in the center of the city and continuing to do labor, forced labor in the city. That camp was a terrible place. There were basically no resources. So there was a letter we have from the head of the Jewish community begging the Germans for straw. Could they please have straw so the men could sleep on the straw and not on the ground? And the Jewish women in the community brought the men what they needed, like the basics, food. I picture like maybe like a pair of clean socks, like the very basic things that you needed to survive. And my grandmother did that. So she could occasionally see my grandfather at night and bring him food. And then one day she was doing that. She arrived at the camp. The gates were open and no one was there. And my grandfather had just disappeared. But the rumors were, and this made sense, they had moved them for work elsewhere for the Reich. Now, my grandfather was in his early 30s. You know, he had been young and healthy, so that made sense that that had happened. My grandmother chose to believe that, and she actually never gave up hope that my grandfather was coming back, never remarried, and never knew what happened. Through our research, I know now what happened, which was that he was likely murdered that day that he disappeared. That's November 1941. The Germans had a system. There was a lot of resistance in Serbia, a strong partisan movement, and every time the partisans shot and killed a German soldier, and 100 of them for every German soldier killed. If the soldier was just wounded, that meant 50 civilians were killed. So they went through this reserve of men, Jewish men and also Roma men that they were holding in this camp in the city center, and shot them at close range and buried them in mass graves. And we actually know the date now. So we have a yard site date for my grandfather, but that's new in the last couple of years with research.
So I know that your parents are still living, right?
Yes.
So tell me what your father's, is it Brill?
Yes.
Or was it Brill where he switched it to another name to make it Americanized?
That was the name. In the Serbian spelling, there's one L, Bril, but that, yes, we are Brills going back.
And how did he, just tell our audience, how did he come from the Holocaust, from where to where, and how did he get to where? So you're in Massachusetts. I don't know if they landed in somehow, they've always been in Massachusetts, but why don't you tell a little bit about their history?
Sure. So after the war, my grandmother goes back to their home with my father, who's 6 or so then, and his younger sister, who was born after her father, my grandfather, disappeared. They live in their home, but it's communism now. Their home is too big, declared too big for them. They live with strangers. They live in one part of their home. Eventually, they move into the Jewish Community Center in their neighborhood. They're in the Jewish neighborhood. And things are terrible. There's still not enough food. There's retribution killings on the street. And my grandmother is just, she's devastated. She's waiting for my grandfather to come home, and she is just horrified at what happened in her country. My grandfather was held in a camp in the city center, and we went there, and you just see, God, people were walking back and forth. They were going to work, they were going home, they were going to see a friend, they were going to a football match, a soccer match. You know, they were just living their lives walking by this terrible prison where these men who had not committed a crime were held under these horrible conditions. So my grandmother was really just done with Europe. And in 1948, Israel becomes a state. Jewish refugees can go there, and my grandmother is on, the story is they're on the second boat out of Yugoslavia. The first one was for people with very young children, and my aunt and my father at that point are 10 and 6, so they're on the second boat. They get to Israel, it's Christmas Day, 1948. So they went from one kind of recovery from a war to an active war zone. My father and my aunt go to school there. My they serve in the IDF, in the Israeli military, where service is compulsory. And then after service, my dad wants to be an engineer. There's just one university there, Technion at the time, and he doesn't get in. So he comes here to Boston to go to school. He's a graduate from Northeastern. And while he's a student there, somehow, with very little English, he meets my mom. The story is they were kind of set up by a neighbor who knew my dad was a neighbor of my mom, gave my dad my mom's phone number. He called her, carried it around in his pocket for a while, called her from a payphone. She happens to be home and answers. And he has said, I wouldn't have called her again. And they dated, they fell in love, they got married, and they stayed here. My mom is from here. She was born in Boston. So that's how we all are here.
Really nice story. And so let's go back and take you back to why have you decided to invest all of your time and energy into writing this book?
So I'm maybe a reluctant author. I don't know if we're allowed to say that. I was very interested always in researching my family history. When my kids were grown in 2017, my younger daughter went to college, and I had sort of the time and the mental space to do it, and I started to research it. Initially, just for us. I wanted to be able to give it to my father. I wanted my kids and my niece and my nephew to know, and that was really the extent of it. The more I researched, the more I understood, first of all, why I didn't know this story, the story of the Holocaust in Serbia, and second of all, that no one knows it. And that really was the reason I wrote the book. It felt like a thing I had to do. There's something called the Auschwitz paradox. Timothy Snyder says, people know about Auschwitz, but most Jews did not die in Auschwitz. They were murdered outside the camps before Auschwitz was even up and running. And we don't know those stories because you need survivors, you need descendants to tell those stories. In Serbia, there were so few survivors and descendants, the story has not been told. And so it felt like a burden and a blessing to do this. I really wanted to represent my family, of course, and get the story right. But also the Jews of Serbia, what happened, not just in the war, which is, of course, horrific, but before then, there was a vibrant community there for centuries, and people don't know about that. The first Ladino printing press was in Belgrade. It was a Jewish center, a Sephardic center, and later also Ashkenazi community that lived there pretty separately, separate schools and synagogues and cemeteries. But my father's grandparents were actually intermarried, Ashkenazi and Sephardic, which is very unusual. So just finding these pieces and wanting to share what had happened.
And
someone had to do it.
you mentioned Serbia, and you also mentioned Yugoslavia earlier. Perhaps you can tell the audience, and we often think that Serbia came later after the war.
Yes.
But maybe you can tell us a little bit about what happened during the Holocaust with Serbia and Yugoslavia.
Yes, the history is confusing. I mean, certainly it was to me. We didn't learn this history in the public schools in the 80s in the US. So Yugoslavia was a kingdom before World War II. It actually dated back to the end of World War I. Woodrow Wilson thought it would be a good idea if they created a country out of these separate, different Balkan cultures. So they made the country of Yugoslavia. It was a kingdom, and the center of it was Belgrade, the capital city. And that, of course, is where my family was from. And the Jewish neighborhood of Dorchel was in the city center. So, like, my family was in the middle of all of this. They're going along before World War II. The king is acting king for his nephew, who is considered too young to have the position. And this king makes a deal with Germany to try to avoid war. He signs a pact. When the Yugoslav people realize that, they are so outraged. They go on strike, they picket, they're in the street with signs. They'd rather have a war than a pact. They don't want to work with Germany. They get rid of that king. They put in the real king, who's just a teenager. who does not, like, negates the pact, and that's why Hitler was doing that surprise bombing in April of 1941. Once the Germans come in very quickly in 1941, they divide Yugoslavia up back into original countries. So Serbia during the war is its own country again, run by Germans with these Serbs who are collaborating. And so the stories of what happened in Yugoslavia very much depend on what part you're in. And then further, Serbia was split. So the top part of Serbia went to be part of Hungary, which things were pretty good for Jews in Hungary during the war until they were terrible at the end. But the rest of Serbia, the Holocaust is very early, 1941. By spring of 1942, the Nazis are declaring Belgrade Judenfrei. It's the first city to be declared free of Jews. So things are happening very quickly in that part of Serbia.
And so when you were writing your book, did you also discover how many Jews were killed in the Holocaust, both in Yugoslavia and in Serbia?
Yeah, so the numbers are very high. In Serbia, it's about 90%. And of this sort of small but mighty Jewish community based in Belgrade. But there were other places too, Novi Sad and other cities in Yugoslavia was a pretty big country. So I think about my grandparents and how, of course, no one could anticipate the Holocaust coming, right? I mean, people knew about anti-Semitism certainly, but no one, I think, had the capacity to imagine the kind of atrocities that were coming. And because it happened so fast and so early, that's part of how I think they got caught in that trap. There really wasn't time to get out. My grandfather had tried to get false papers. He paid for them and they never arrived. But I think he was also hesitant to run because he had a wife and a young child. His wife was pregnant. And so he waited too long. He had brothers who survived who, got out earlier, moved faster.
So when you were writing this book, and how long did it take you to write it?
I started for real in 2017. I was always collecting family stories, so maybe, I don't know, 50 years. But in 2017, I sat down and started to write it. I was still living it at the time. I mean, I did a trip to Serbia with my dad and my daughters in 2017 and again in 2018, and the last one is 2022. So the story covers 2017 to 2022. I was writing it and rewriting it the whole time. You need to know the ending to be able to write towards it, and I hadn't lived the ending yet, so it was a little like building the plane while flying it. But I worked on it starting in 2017. The final draft went in late last year, 2024. So 7 years, really, a little more.
And so who's your publisher, or it's self-published?
Not self-published. It's with Amsterdam Publishers. They're based in Amsterdam. And it's a fabulous, small but mighty press. They focus on Holocaust stories. So survivor stories, 2G and 3G stories, second generation and third generation of survivors. I was sending the manuscript out and people were saying, great book, great writing. We're so interested in the story. There's Holocaust fatigue. Nobody is going to want to hear this story. So finding Amsterdam publishers and their focus, Elizabeth, who runs it, does not think, people are tired of these stories. These stories are very important.
I know Elizabeth. I've done quite a number of interviews with Amsterdam Press authors.
Yes.
And so the title Hidden in Plain Sight is interesting to me. What made you pick that title, and how would you relate that title to the audience? And maybe you can tell us the two children who are sitting on the front cover and why and who they are and why you chose this as their front cover.
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. So somehow, not only did my father and his sister and his mother survive the war, but we had a couple of pictures that did. And in my childhood, those pictures were mysteriously in an envelope somewhere. They would like surface. My mom would be cleaning. We would hold them by the corners. We would look at them, and then they would kind of disappear again. One was of my grandparents' wedding, and I would look at that picture, and they like looked so young. My grandmother was so pretty. And the story was she's wearing this white dress with a long train. And the story is that she will cut up that train for clothes for her children. She needs fabric during the war. So it's like this beautiful picture, but we know what's coming, but they don't know what's coming. And then two more pictures. One, my grandfather holding my father as a baby. One, my grandmother with my father as a toddler. And then the fourth picture was this picture that we're looking at. It's the picture of my father and my aunt. They are standing on the street. This is during the Nazi occupation of Belgrade where they live. And he's there with my aunt, his baby sister. And like, how is this possible? And just from the time I was little, I would look at this, like, how is this possible? Dad, how did you survive? How can this be? And I never really got an answer that made sense to me. That's part of what launched me on the research. Now I understand even more how extraordinary this picture was. Somehow my grandmother got this photographed and developed, I think, so she would have a picture of the children for her husband when he was coming home. That was her dream. Um,
So
but
can I
yeah,
ask,
of course.
there's no yellow stars on the clothing. So in Yugoslavia or in Belgrade or in Serbia, the Nazis didn't require yellow stars?
Thank you for that question. The Nazis absolutely did require yellow stars. These children are not marked that way as Jews. They could not be on the street if they were. This picture was taken after the Nazis said, hey, we've made the capital city Judenfrei. There are no Jews in Belgrade. So it was this mysterious picture. How could this had exist? How did my family survive? Now I know you you think about, like, we all have cameras in our pockets. We're taking pictures of our lunch, right? Cameras, of course, were rare in the 40s, but in occupied Europe, they were illegal. The Germans didn't want you taking pictures of anything on the street because you could inadvertently or on purpose give away a military secret. So just the layers of the mystery of this picture and how they could survive, and not just survive, but they're hiding and not hiding. And that's the title. They're hidden in plain sight. No one knows they're there, but they are clearly on the street.
So we didn't really cover this. What was your career? And why did you feel that you could write this book?
Yeah. My whole career has been working with parents in the childbearing year. So I worked as a doula, someone helping people to give birth, a childbirth educator. My main work focus right now is I'm a lactation consultant. So I help people feed their babies. I went into that work naively because now, of course, I understand I have my own children as well. What a difficult time that perinatal year can be. But I went into it in my early 20s thinking this is the opposite of whatever Holocaust studies are, right? Like, this is a focus on new life. The people are really happy. This is like such a magical time of promise, right? So that's how I got into it. I always kind of thought I was a writer. I was a reader from really early on. I was the kid, with a book in her bag or by her bed or in the car in the back seat. I always wanted to write. I wrote book reviews for a local newspaper when I was a preteen. I was reviewing YA books. My mom was typing them up and delivering them to the editor. So I was always focused on a little bit on writing. I took some courses in college. I wrote a book about 10 years ago that was an anthology for doulas called Round the Circle. I wrote a lot for work. And then I started writing short pieces about about my family and the Holocaust in Serbia, and they were getting published. So I really understood that people are interested in this story. People want to hear all the stories. All the stories are important.
So I'm really interested in the interest of your parents in you writing this story.
Yeah,
And it
yeah.
took 7 years. So tell me about your father's recollections of you writing. Your mother must be, both of them must be incredibly proud of you that you've undertaken this type of story. I'd love to hear how your mother relates to your father, one a Holocaust survivor, one born in America. That's a very unusual combination for this period of time. So let's kind of go there, and then I'll transition back to, you mentioned that you took a trip to Yugoslavia and Serbia with your father and your daughter. So let's go to the first question. I know I put a layered number of questions on you. Hopefully you can remember them. But why don't you take it from there, those questions, and then we'll go to Yugoslavia together.
Sure. So, my parents are very proud. I mean, I like that's the first thing. They have been 100% supportive all along. I wouldn't have written this. It's not a tell-all. I wouldn't have written this if I didn't have family support. They all, not just my parents, but my daughters and my brother, read early versions. Partly because I wanted to get it right. You know, everybody remembers a situation a little bit differently. Like, is this really what happened? The accuracy was very important to me. And also, I didn't want to reveal anything or tell a story that they didn't want told. My parents were always clear from the beginning that I should do this, that it's important. I don't think my father ever thought his stories from his early childhood and his family photos would be on the internet and out in the world. So there is a little kind of, I think it's odd maybe, but he's getting recognition now that he never got before. People are interested in his story, and I think that has been helpful for him. He never really considered himself to be a Holocaust survivor. So, he wasn't in a camp. He went to Israel in 48, where there were survivors from concentration camps, people from Auschwitz with the numbers on their arms. And that became, the focus, of course, and what people thought of as Holocaust survivors. But also, I want to say there was no recognition in being a Holocaust survivor in Israel in the 40s or 50s. It wasn't something that people wanted to claim. There wasn't a pride in that. It was very much something that before the Eichmann trials, Israel was not focused on. And then my father came here to the US in 64 and went to school and worked like an immigrant and, just focused on making a life here. So it wasn't anything that he's ever really focused on or talked about until recently. He's now done an interview for the US Holocaust Memorial Museum in DC. So that is very nice. And he's, come to some events with me. So I think that that's been something that we are doing together.
He hasn't gone into schools and talked about it himself?
He's not done that, no.
Okay. And how did your mother and your father's relationship get impacted by the Holocaust?
Yeah, I mean, my father was always very open about telling his stories. I think some Holocaust survivors don't share with family. We always knew, but we never had the context for it. I mean, I don't want to speak too much for my mother, but I'm not sure that she really understood until we have this book and this research of what really, the greater context was of what he was living through. Certainly their childhoods were very different. My mother grew up here, middle class. My grandfather was a doctor. He had come as a 12-year-old. But he worked his way, learned the language, worked his way up, became a doctor. My grandmother went to Tufts, which is very unusual for that generation. She was born in 1910. My mother grew up sort of in a solid, settled way here. Very different experience from my father.
And so let's now move to your trip. What did you decide that you had to get up and go? And you obviously didn't go on your own. You decided to take your father. It's quite amazing also that your father wanted to go back.
Yes.
I wanted to kind of just recoup. I'm one of the Holocaust 2Gs. My parents, both survivors, never spoke.
Right.
It's almost verboten to ask a question. They went from my mother from Auschwitz to tried to get to Israel or Palestine, 1947, was stopped at Port Tel Aviv and sent to Cyprus for another year.
Yeah,
My
terrible.
father escaped from Nazi Berlin in 1935 at age 15, 2 months after the Nuremberg laws were passed on a program called Youth Aliyah out of Germany with teenagers over 10 years. He went alone with 100 teenagers through Italy on a ship Galilee to Port Haifa. He then grew up in Kibbutz Ugor, which is right outside of Haifa. And as your father was there in 1948, my father was in the Air Force, Haganah Air Force, fighting in 1948. My mother was released from Cyprus and she came over to Port Tel Aviv. And my parents met at the Golden Beach in Tel Aviv and were married in 1950. They came to the United States, sponsored to Allentown, Pennsylvania in 1954 with my sister.
Yeah. All the stories are they're fascinating and they're improbable, like that anybody survived and could function in a somewhat normal way.
When you get into this niche, and you probably already know this, it's a very small world. When I first started this group, it was because, and I can just step back for 2 seconds and say that I wanted, because of my parents never talking about it, I was traumatized. And I can remember in the 5th grade that my teacher separated the good kids from the bad kids.
Yeah.
And put the bad kids in the back row. And it just so happened was like a pretty populated Jewish elementary school. And every morning would play Jose Feliciano's Light My Fire. And I didn't want to go to school.
Yeah.
And that's, knowing now, that's probably the first time I experienced anti-Semitism. And throughout my technology career, every time something kind of was a difficult challenge, I had Nazi nightmares.
Yeah.
And so I wanted nothing to do with the Holocaust. I never read a book. I never watched a movie. I never went to a memorial service. I never even could watch Hogan's Heroes growing up. And when I retired with my wife, Myra, of now going to be 39 years, we moved to San Diego from Minneapolis. I'm originally from Allentown, Pennsylvania. I'm now in Philadelphia. We ran into, we went in October of 2019, and we eventually met the show group in San Diego, which had about 150 members. And I was invited to go. I didn't want to go. Myra forced me to go. And we had, I met about 50, 2Gs. About 50% of them talked. And this is a really interesting story.
Yeah.
And so I was introduced by someone who introduced us to the group. And I met a woman named Ava Sakarian. And Ava and I and Myra were talking, and Ava said to me, well, where was your mother from? And I said, Košice, Czechoslovakia. And she said, well, was your mother in Auschwitz? I said, yes. And she then said to her sister, who was on the other side of the room, she called over to Ida, who's her 4-year-old sister. Ida, come over here. She says, where was mom from? And Ida says to Ava, why are you asking me this question? You know where mom was from. She was from Košice, Czechoslovakia.
You're probably cousins.
Well, you're getting there.
Yeah.
And so all of a sudden, Ida calls over her younger brother, Henry. Henry comes over and he said, Henry, what was mom's maiden name? And he says, Ida, you and Ava, you know what it was. It was Friedman. And I said, OMG.
Yeah. Yeah.
My mom's maiden name was Friedman.
Yeah.
And right there in the first 5 minutes of a 20-year journey, not ever wanting to know anything about the Holocaust, I have no cousins other than my sister living in the United States. I have now 3 family cousins in San Diego who we constantly talk about with each other.
Yeah.
So
Gives me chills.
talking about a small world.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I founded this group because that night I decided I needed to know more. And in 2008, my sister recorded my mother and father's story, who they refused to tell because they were in ill health. My father told a very robust story, though he wasn't in a concentration camp, but he lived alone and escaped. It's quite something that that his parents were willing to let him go at age 15.
Yeah.
And then my mother, when I opened that document, completely left out 1942 to 1946
Yeah.
in that document. So I knew nothing. And so I started the group with the hope of having 25 people tell me their stories about Auschwitz. So I would learn my mother's story, and 25 people who were Berliners and their parents talked. So I
Right.
thought, let's start a group of 50 people. Did I ever know that there'd be 10,000 people in the
Yeah.
group today?
Yeah.
It is an amazing story, but that's talking too long. I want to interview you.
No, fascinating. And I just heard there's a million of us, 2G, 3G, 4Gs in the US. Like we all feel somehow like we're by ourselves, but we're not.
So coming back, let's talk about your trip
Yes.
and the decision making on why you decided to go, who decided to go with you, and I'll turn it over for you and you to tell us about it.
Yeah. So I always wanted to go to Belgrade. It felt a little like Oz, like this place you couldn't get to, this magical place, partly because of my father's stories, but partly growing up in the Cold War in Yugoslavia. It was communist. It was very far away. My father was here working like an immigrant. There wasn't time and money, and I don't speak Serbian, and there were all of these barriers. Was I was an adult and starting to think about it, then there's the Balkan Wars. So all of these things in the way. And suddenly I just realized like we could go. I actually opened the book Hidden in Plain Sight with a scene. It's my dad and my daughter Rebecca and I, and we're on her laptop on Google Maps, and my father is navigating, she's driving, like we're in the Google car, and we're going through Dorchel, through his neighborhood. We're looking at the house, we're looking at the synagogue. We're like, there was this moment where it just was like, oh, this is actually a place we can go to. It sounds so ridiculous because of course it's on a map and you could get there. But that was really the beginning, looking at it on Google Maps and seeing, these are places I want to stand at. I want to stand outside the building where my father lived. I want to go and see, where these places are that he remembers. And he was game. And so we were just going to go, the two of us. And then my daughter wanted to come, my teenage daughter, so she came too. And it was a phenomenal experience on so many levels. But I realized Belgrade is my dad's hometown. He is from here. We are from here. There's a saying, I live in Massachusetts, but there's a saying in Vermont, you're a Vermonter when you have 4 grandparents in the ground. And so I'm not from anywhere. I never will be on that definition. My father is from Belgrade, and we went to the cemetery where family was buried. He had memories he'd never had before because place triggers memories. So we stayed in the Hotel Moskva, which was Gestapo headquarters during the war, so felt weird to stay there, but also my dad remembered it from after the war. He would stand on the street and look at these like fancy, rich patrons sitting in the cafe, eating sweets and drinking coffee and probably smoking. He had this idea of it as this like special place. And so we went and we stayed there. And the first day we came out of the hotel, we're there with our guide, my dad, my daughter, we're ready to go. And my father had a new memory. And what he remembered was his aunt had lived across the street from the hotel. He was explaining it above the elevator. My dad's an engineer, so he remembered the elevator engine, the mechanics of it. She lived above that. And they went there in 1948 to say goodbye. My grandmother, my father, my aunt, they were leaving forever. And he remembered going to say goodbye to her there. So he was like very much from the place that we were standing. That was very powerful. And he remembered everything. At one point, the guide's car stalled and we decided to walk. We get out of the car, and I think we're so far from the hotel. We've driven in this big circle, and my father makes a beeline. He knows exactly where we are. He knows exactly where we're going. Like he has the map of the city in his brain.
So your father is how old when he left?
He was 10. So he was born in 1938. They left as soon as they could in 1948. He was
Memories
10.
are that clear.
So clear. He said he never had a radio or a TV. The thing he did was he went outside and he walked. He just walked. That was like the thing to do.
Wow. And so the impressions that you were left with, I'd like to know if you would ask your daughter what you think her top impressions were, and if you would ask your father, what do you think his top impressions were?
Oh, that's so. One of the things that really surprised me was how welcomed we were by everyone, by Serbians coming back. And I say coming back, I hadn't been there before, but it felt like coming back. You know, you fly into the Nikola Tesla airport, that's the airport in Belgrade, and we think of him as an American immigrant, right? Came from Serbia. Like they still hold a place for people who have left, and there is this leaving and coming back that I couldn't imagine. That was really affirming. At one point, on a second trip with my other daughter, we're sitting in this cafe at the Hotel Moskva, watching people walk by, people watching, you know, and do we look like them? Do they look like us? Do we pass as Serbian? We are Serbian. There's like certain things that we do because of this heritage. Across the street from the hotel is a Pelichinki stand. A Pelichinki is like a crepe, but it's not exactly a crepe. And my mom made them. She still makes them. Like on a Sunday morning, you make them one at a time, so it takes a lot of time. But it was like this special treat, and I thought pelachinkis were a thing we just ate in our family. Sophie, my daughter, thought they were a thing from Israel. They're a thing from Serbia. You know, like
Mhm.
culture is transmitted through food. Like we have this other piece, and so again and again we were shown that, and that really struck me. The other thing that really struck me was not just do we not know the history of the Serbian Holocaust in the US, it's not well known in Serbia either. So we went to the place that I described where my grandfather was forced to register at the beginning of the occupation. It's an old fort in the city center called Kalamagdan, but it's a park now. So it's grassy. You would go there, throw a frisbee, walk your dog, meet a friend, you know. No sign of what happened there. No signs when we went in 2017 with any names of Holocaust victims. We went to the camp where my grandfather was held, no sign. You would not know what happened there. It's not a museum. It's two falling down buildings and an overgrown lot with stray dogs. So that was the other part that really struck me was like Serbia. There were the partisans who were fighting the Germans. They were also fighting the Checheniks, the royalists. There was a civil war going on while they were all fighting the Germans, and also the Checheniks were working with the Germans. It's a very complicated history. There were also, of course, Serbian collaborators. The documents I have from that time for my family are in Serbian. So the street pass with my grandfather's name on it is in Serbian. The registration list of the Jewish men is in Serbian. So there was a lot of collaboration as well as resistance. The Serbian government, I think, would be pleased to say that they have one of the best restitution programs in Europe. They have given based on property, like unclaimed property, this heirless property that was owned by Jews. On the other hand, like I said, there were no markers with the names of Jews who were murdered. The Serbs have their own more recent history of genocide in Bosnia. I think that complicates it. They were very anti-fascist while they were communist, but when they became anti-communist, they, I would say, became less anti-fascist. My father was very excited to go to Belgrade to see. There was a monument with the names of partisans, and we had family who were fighting in the partisans, and he wanted to see that. I did too. That monument no longer exists. So when they overturned communism, some of that anti-fascism went away as well. It's very complicated, but I will say that there's a huge resistance movement in Serbia right now, led by the students. Hundreds of thousands of people were on the streets just last week in Belgrade. We're recording this in March 2025, so maybe things are changing.
Okay, and so coming back to your daughter, what would you think her top memories would be?
Yeah, I think for her it's similar. She grew up very close to my parents. They lived close by geographically, just down the street. They spent a lot of time together. She also heard these stories of my father's from when he was very little, and we talked about what it meant. And so I think it's similar in terms of being able to locate the place, the physical place where these memories happened as being a really significant thing. I think having her there was wonderful for a lot of reasons. We could kind of bounce the day off each other. There was a lot going on all the time emotionally. But, you know, she is the next generation. So hopefully for both my daughters, they will carry these stories forward. And they both have memories of being in Belgrade, hearing those stories from my father.
Did you grow up with any intergenerational survivor trauma, any trauma from your father? Was he affected by the Holocaust? As we know, many survivors were in the middle of the night, were crying and severely incapacitated with memory issues. Can you speak? I don't
Yeah.
open up an inappropriate door, but I was just curious, since my own history comes out, which I disclosed. We have a
Right.
lot of members in our community who suffer from intergenerational trauma. And now with the October 7th war, people have kind of returned to what it was like for them to hear their parents speak about the Holocaust, watching the television about babies being killed and burned. And now, it just goes on and on.
Yeah. So, my father, of course, was impacted by his experience. I think there's intergenerational trauma. We can talk about that. Also, intergenerational resilience that got passed down, you know, as survivors and children of survivors. My father was very lucky in that he had a couple of good years before the war, and then he had the sense that my grandmother was protecting him during the war. Whether that was true or not, that was his childhood sense. He did have this feeling of safety that kind of defies examination. So one of the things my grandmother told him, because of course he was circumcised, is never pee anywhere but at home. You're just pee, wet your pants, whatever you have to do. You know, so there was like definitely trauma that was happening and the things he was seeing, and his father was gone, but she somehow was able to protect him in some way that I think he's carried forward his whole life. I was obsessed with the Holocaust as a preteen, literally read every book on my library shelf and every book in the Holocaust in our library at the synagogue, everything I could get my hands on, and worried about what would happen when it came here. Which of our Christian neighbors would hide me? Was I blonde enough to pass? Like, what would happen? And then after that, I just ignored it. It's maybe similar to what you did, Jeffrey. Through my high school years at college and having my kids and trying to shelter my kids from that history, like I did not want to think about it or talk about it. It doesn't really work. You, of course, can't just push it away and pretend it didn't happen. But I was not focused on it. And now, having written about it, so many people have told me, "Oh, I had that same experience. I read Anne Frank and I wondered how we would hide in our house." Like I think it's a much more common experience than I knew at the time. But at the time, it felt very isolating. Um, just, with all these worries. When I started to do the book, it came back. And at one point, I write about this in the book, I made like for myself a no genocide at bedtime rule. Like you can't read these stories before you go to bed because I would just think about them and dream about them all night long, like it was coming back again.
So tell me about your grandmother. How did she get to the United States?
She didn't. So my grandmother died in Israel. I never got to know her. So she died when she was 50. Part of what I imagine is for both my grandparents, my grandmother was born in 1914, my grandfather was born in 1909, I was born in 1970. Like I should have grown up with them, right? Knowing them. Um, she came to Israel in 1948. I think there was a period of shock. I mean, it was, there wasn't enough food in the country. The country was at war. There were open sewers where they were living. First, they were living in tents, I don't think she was prepared for that. Like, who would be? And then they learned the language. The kids went to school. My grandmother worked as a seamstress, but she never got over my grandfather. She never remarried. I think she was always waiting for him to come on some level. And she died, we think, of a heart condition in her sleep at 50. I feel like she died of a broken heart. And she died. My dad had just come here as a student. And she actually, he got on a plane. People got him on a plane to send him back. But, they were doing the burial so quickly then, like the funeral was over by the time he got there.
So I was kind of wanting you to kind of wrap it up and let our audience know what you would like them to leave with from the book that you wrote, the audiences that you're talking with, the connections that you're making around the world.
Yeah. So the book is called Hidden in Plain Sight. It's a family memoir and the untold story of the Holocaust in Serbia. You can read it on different levels. One level is, middle-aged American woman trying to figure out her family's past and family's secrets. And that's just something I hope everybody will do if you have any interest. Record your older relatives, ask them questions, ask them the same questions on a different day or in a different way, get everything you can, do whatever internet research you can do, and then ask them questions about what you find out. I always thought history was done. We only knew what we were going to know, but in the case of Holocaust documents, there are more and more things coming out. The research that I did, I got documents that hadn't been available even a few years before. There's an article in the New York Times today about new Kinder transports to England that we never had before. So there's new information all the time. That's one thing. And then there's the very small thing, which is no family is just like my family. Here's the story of my family and what happened to them in the war. And I really tried to write about the larger story about the Jews of Serbia and to pay tribute to that community, which, by the way, there are still Jews in Serbia. There is a small and mighty community there still, but to tell the story of what happened because people don't know.
So according to you, what are the challenges to teach the Holocaust in your country, so in Serbia?
So it is hard to say, but it seems that we are not learned from history almost anything. So Holocaust is a very important topic, and many people said that is so important that it is not good to leave just to historians to deal with that topic. Well, students knowing history is one thing, but teaching and learning about values is other thing. So I believe that attitudes are more important than facts. Of course, you need facts to build your attitudes. I believe that most challenging question about teaching Holocaust is to inspire students to think what is my connection with that topic? Why I have to listen that? What is my business with that? Is it something what touching me or I don't have connection with that? What shall I do if I be a perpetrator maybe? Can I be a victim? Or maybe can I be bystanders or something similar, Because we never know how we will be reacted in some extreme situation. And it is very important to inspire students to think about it, to worry about it. What is my connection with that topic?
Silna Polska,
Thank you.